And that was my big question to you, wasn't it, Michael? It was like, do you remember when we first spoke about this and you told me all the documents you'd had sight of and access to? And I was like, okay, where's the psych report? What do the psych say? And you're like, there isn't one. And I was like, hang on, what? Like, I've never heard that. Given the whole case pivots around his mental state, how is there no psych report? I do not understand.
Well, that's actually why I FOI'd this, and this is what I got. So this appears to be it.
Well, that's more bizarre. If anything, that makes it stranger.
That's Dr. Xanthi Mallett. You might remember her from an earlier episode of this podcast. She's a forensic anthropologist and associate professor at the University of Newcastle. And what she's talking about is a story we've spent the past year investigating. A man who was convicted of murdering his 3 sons by driving them into a dam on Father's Day. The man, Robert Farquharson, insisted it was an accident, that he'd had a coughing fit and passed out. The prosecution said he'd killed them deliberately because he was so angry at his ex-wife, Cindy, for ending their marriage. They said his motive was revenge. 2 juries agreed with the prosecution, and Farquharson is serving 33 years in jail. But now a group of scientists and experts are casting doubt on that prosecution and asking if the system got it wrong. Anyway, when I was doing the original reporting for this podcast, Xanthi Mallett gave me a pretty big revelation. She pointed out to me a gaping hole in the evidence against Robert Farquharson. It seemed like nobody had done a psychological evaluation of him. You might remember that conversation I had with Xanthi back at the time.
If they're saying that this was because of, basically psychological pressure and all of that, then I would definitely have expected a psych report, probably one for the prosecution, one for the defence.
That's never occurred to me before, but of course there should be a psych report. Where's the psych report?
And it was that interview with Xanthi that started me off on a whole new line of reporting. Remember, she suggested I speak to Tim Watson-Munro. He's a criminal psychologist, and I asked him if the lack of a psych report was unusual.
I find that extraordinary. Given the magnitude, it's a triple murder, right? Not just killing one person, but 3 died. And given what's on the table, I find it extraordinary.
I tried to ask Robert Farquharson's longtime barrister about it. I even got a question to Farquharson in prison. He confirmed he'd never been psychologically assessed. And just to cover all the bases, I put in a Freedom of Information request to police, just in case they'd produced a report that nobody else had seen. I didn't really expect anything back. Surely if such a report had been written, it would have turned up in the court, right? Surely the prosecution would have showed it to the judge and the jury. Turns out, I was wrong. From the newsrooms of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, this is Trial by Water. I'm Michael Batchelard, and this is our second bonus episode, The Psych Report.
Hey.
Hello.
So tell me what you got.
So I've got this psych report from police. It's like, I didn't think there was one, and I just put this FOI into the police, and here it is, it's turned up. A few weeks ago, an email lobbed into my inbox from the police's FOI branch. Good morning, Mr. Batchelard, it said. Please find a zip folder attached in relation to the above Freedom of Information request. I opened it, and inside the zip file was a psych report.
What's in it?
Well, look, it's pretty thin. It's only sort of 7 pages long.
Okay.
And there's a whole bunch of redactions because for privacy reasons, and they don't want to give away police methods.
Okay.
But it's quite interesting. The report had been commissioned by the police. A consultant wrote it up and delivered it to investigators on November the 18th, 2005. That's 2.5 months after Farquharson's car plunged into the dam, and only a few weeks before he was charged with triple murder. This report never made it into the court case, and as far as I know, has never been seen before in public. And now I had it in my hands.
I can't believe we actually got something.
Honestly, putting that FOI into police was like a Hail Mary, and
Totally.
This is what it turned up.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're going to go through it in detail. This report was written by a psychologist called Michael Davis, and right at the top he says he never actually interviewed Farquharson for it. He's based it on the statements police supplied to him, as well as the videos of Farquharson's police interview and his lie detector test. So he says it's just an investigative tool, not to be used in court. And he writes that if he'd been given different information by police, he might have come to a different conclusion. Now, we can't actually tell which statements police have supplied him, because the names are redacted for privacy reasons. But it looks to me like Cindy's statement isn't there. And that's pretty important, because she told police that there had been no violence or coercion in her relationship with Farquharson. A proper psych report is much more comprehensive than this report. It takes in the subject's history, their upbringing, what their friends and family say about them. It also involves interviewing the subject, probably several times, and you couldn't do all that in 7 pages. Even the guy who wrote this report, Michael Davis, was downplaying its value. He also said he couldn't talk to us because the report was the property of police. So what did the police want out of this report? Well, mainly they wanted help with strategy. At the time, they were planning to hold a second formal interview with Farquharson, and they wanted to get him to confess to murder. So they were after some psychological tips about how to approach him. In the end, that interview never took place. So, with all that in mind, why are we taking this report seriously? Well, it came just a few weeks before Farquharson was charged, and it's still the only attempt police made to figure out his psyche. And for that reason, I reckon it deserves some scrutiny. So I sent it to Tim and Xanthi. And then a couple of weeks ago, I got them on a group call.
Can I just really quickly check, sorry, and have you, Tim and Xanthi, both hit record on your end?
Yep.
Let's go.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us. These two live in different cities and they come from different generations, but they clearly have a bond.
Yeah, we think very similarly.
That's exactly what I was going to say, that hive mind.
They even host their own true crime podcast together, Motive and Method. Tim, Xanthi, what do you make of this psych report, or what's described as an indirect personality assessment?
My concern was the fact that this is based purely on those statements. Not only has the psychologist not interviewed the accused, but not interviewed any of these individuals directly. And we know that when police question witnesses or whomever in relation to an event, the questions can be taken in a certain direction, and statements can be quite it can be focused around those areas of questioning. So my concern is that the statements are already potentially leading to a conclusion. So we've not got a full picture here.
Tim didn't like it much either.
There's some fairly strident statements in the report referable to intent. And I can say that having given evidence in the Supreme Court in murder trials on hundreds of occasions over the decades, the one thing you never talk about is intent, because no degree of expertise will enable you to say with certainty what was going on in an individual's mind at the moment that they committed an offence.
When Tim talks about intent, he's referring to a part of the report with the headline, Likely Motives. In this section, the psychologist writes that there were, in his mind, 3 possible ways that Farquharson and his boys ended up in the dam. The first possibility was that Farquharson was telling the truth. He coughed and passed out. The second possibility was that it was a suicide gone wrong. Farquharson had tried to kill himself, then changed his mind, but it was too late to save the kids. The third possibility was the one the prosecution ultimately ran with, that Farquharson had murdered Jay, Tyler and Bailey to punish Cindy for the end of their marriage and her starting a new relationship. In his report, Davis came to the conclusion that he thought it was deliberate, but more likely a suicide gone wrong. The accident theory he dismissed pretty quickly, based on what police had told him about the night of the crash. And Davis said that if it had been deliberate, a calculated act to get back at Cindy, then Farquharson would have wanted to rub it in more, to go to Cindy and gloat about what he'd done. And in favour of the suicide gone wrong theory, Davis said it was symbolic that it had happened on Father's Day. He also pointed out that Farquharson was taking antidepressants. So I asked Tim and Xanthi about how important Farquharson's depression was to the case.
Well, look, I mean, if I were looking at this case at work, I would certainly make note of it, but many people get depressed.
Xanthi said it was normal for people to get depressed after something like the breakup of a marriage.
Some people suffer from depression quite naturally, normally, as a result of a traumatic experience. So I would note it, but the fact that somebody has depression, would be a minor consideration for me when looking at the seriousness of this crime.
Another piece of evidence that Davis cited was that Farquharson had an avoidant personality and controlled emotions. He described him as brooding, said his love for his children was, quote, expressed through overprotectiveness and playing sport with them. It describes him as avoidant, emotionally controlled and brooding, and says that he bottled up his anger. In the scenario we're looking at, are these kind of psychologically compelling symptoms?
Well, again, I mean, it's such a serious crime, isn't it? I mean, certainly I didn't see, when I looked at this, when we first spoke about this, probably many months ago now, I didn't see anything in his history which could indicate or would predict that he would be able or capable of this level of violence. But I could see Tim wanting to jump in.
Oh no, look, we tend to agree on the things. I would add to that, particularly where there's no prior history of explosions or poor impulse control. If anything, he strikes me as being a very over-controlled person. But it doesn't mean because you're over-controlled, all of a sudden, when you're motoring down the Geelong freeway or wherever it was, you're going to drive your car into a lake. I think that's a sort of false logic, really. And there's no indication of a violent disposition at all.
Tim and Xanthi don't criticise their fellow professional. But both of them are saying the evidence Davis is citing just isn't strong enough to support the theory that these deaths were deliberate. Basically, though, this report went nowhere. Police never interviewed Farquharson for a second time. But then I wondered, what if police got this report and it validated their theory that Farquharson's story was a lie? If that's the case, maybe it helped push them towards charging him. Just over 3 weeks after they got this report, that's what they did. I asked Tim and Xanthi about that. To what extent would a statement like this, potentially produced relatively early in an investigation, to what extent could it limit the kinds of thinking that the police allow themselves to do about a case?
Well, I don't know about the full extent of this investigation, but in terms of general principles, it establishes the parameters of the type of questions you may ask. It may validate an intrinsic belief or feeling that this person is guilty, and that, of course, would shape the types of questions and the evidence you look for. What do you think, Xanth?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it could go either way, couldn't it? But given that it does seem to indicate that he believed that the accused was guilty, I can imagine they were more likely to follow that path. And the danger, and I'm not saying that the police were guilty of this in this case, but the danger is that police can get involved, tunnel vision. They have a line of thinking, they follow that, and then you get the confirmation bias, everything confirms it, and ignoring, subconsciously or consciously, things outside of that kind of worldview. So that would be my concern, that everything seems to be pointing in the same direction, but that may be just because those are the only arrows that you're looking at.
Maybe it's the wrong direction.
Exactly, yeah.
They're shooting for Mars and land on the moon, for example.
Yeah, you're going to ignore the arrows pointing south, even if they're huge.
In episode 5, we talked about tunnel vision. That's the idea that all of us, including police, can have a tendency to focus only on proving our theory, in this case that Farquharson was guilty, and so we ignore and downplay the things that contradict that theory. Could this report have played into that? We'll probably never know, but there is one other person we can ask. Her name's also on Michael Davis's report. It's Deb Bennett. She was a police officer for 40 years, so I gave her a call, and then Ruby and I went to visit. That's after the break. so with the dog. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Who's this?
This is Pablo.
Hello, Pablo. Are you going to bite me? We're at Deb Bennett's place in an inner Melbourne suburb. We settle down at her kitchen table and she busts out a big bowl of chocolate-covered pretzels. Pablo the dog takes his place by her feet.
You might sit in here or do
Yep, I'm happy in here.
Yes, budget.
Yeah, happy in here.
Yeah. Can I get you a soda water?
Yeah. Deb didn't write any of Michael Davis's report, but he cites a 2-hour meeting they had when he was preparing it. Deb doesn't work for the police anymore, and she's pretty clear that she doesn't want to comment on the report itself, or even on Farquharson's case. She says she just doesn't have enough information. What she is happy to talk about is her long career with Victoria Police, and the ways she thinks that far too often they get things wrong. She started working there in the 1980s.
I went through the ranks as everybody does, and well, not everybody, because in those days, when women graduated, you could go to lost property or children. As it turns out, I did an undercover job for a year or so instead. But yeah, no long pants, girls had to wear a skirt, pantyhose, no matter what the weather. And you got issued with a handbag to put your gun in.
Very useful.
Very useful. It was actually quite a nice handbag. I wish I'd kept it.
As a young rank-and-file officer, Deb worked on ways to try to improve conviction rates in stranger rape cases. Those were the days before DNA evidence, and it was often hard to identify a rapist. She ended up training with FBI criminal profilers.
As part of that program, I needed to do some study in psychology, so I went to uni then.
She went to uni, got a doctorate in psychology and a master's in family therapy. Then, for decades, she worked as a profiler. Eventually, she became a detective senior sergeant. But she was also a woman, and the sexism never disappeared entirely.
Yeah, 40 years, you can imagine, it's been a boys' club for a long time, and a lot of those squads still are, and it has a lot to do with who's at the top. It's not the job that gets you in the end, it's the bureaucracy, the politics, the bullshit. That's what gets you.
One of the other things that gets her is how some police conduct their investigations. Once they make up their minds about something, or someone, she says it's really hard to change them. And woe betide you if you have a different view.
Once the leader has deemed that so-and-so is guilty, then the team, it's your job to bring that case to fruition with that being... It's not, let's keep an open... They say it. We're keeping an open mind, and every time I hear it, I say, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're just saying that because you think that you should, and that's what the public wants to hear. And they do want to hear that, but they actually want you to do it too. Diversity of thought is not well accepted. The policing in general it's a club, and you're either on the inside or you're on the outside. You make a decision about what it is you're doing, who the offender is, and how you're going to go about it, and then in order to belong, you go along. That's not healthy, in my opinion.
In Farquharson's case, police made the decision on the night of the crash that he might be a murderer. They zeroed in on him initially because of his apparently inhuman behaviour on the side of the dam and his train wreck interview in hospital a couple of hours later. But Deb says making judgments on those sorts of things can be really dangerous.
The other thing is that we are very sensitive to people behaving in a way that we don't see ourselves as behaving. So, I wouldn't have cried if such and such happened, or she just looks so stony-faced, like, where was it? So, therefore, she's guilty. And you really cannot jump the gun that early, but it happens time and time again.
But she says that even after 40 years in the job, it was really hard to say these things to her colleagues.
And so if you somebody puts the brakes on or you caution against it, it's not going to go down well. You're not one of the team.
Is that because it's like you're a roadblock to their conviction?
Yeah, exactly.
And so securing a conviction is a victory. It's a win.
Yes, it is, 100%.
I approached police to ask them about what Deb was saying, but they stood by the statement they gave me when I first approached them for comment months ago. They said they were happy with the Farquharson investigation. And as I said, Deb didn't really want to talk in detail about Michael Davis's report. But I put a couple of the key questions to her, like about antidepressants. Did the fact that Robert Farquharson was taking them suggest he was suicidal or murderous?
You know, other than anti-cholesterol tablets, antidepressants are the largest selling drug in the US. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of antidepressants.
It's a lot of people.
A lot of people.
But being on it doesn't necessarily make you a psycho or a...
God, well, given that it's the second, largest drug on sale in the US, can you imagine? No. No.
Deb agrees with Tim and Xanthi that either the prosecution or the defence, or both of them, should have commissioned a full psychological report. That would have meant they were making a proper attempt to get to the truth.
If you were seeking to understand, why wouldn't you get one? But as from a prosecution or defence point of view, yeah, I mean, if you don't know what the answer is, don't ask the question, is probably more a mindset.
Maybe the prosecution didn't want to have a psychologist tell them that when men murder all their children, there's almost always a long and escalating history of domestic violence leading up to it. A history that's just absent in Farquharson's case. And maybe the defence didn't want a psychological profile that found Farquharson maybe was capable of murder. And so all of us, the judge, the jury and the public, were left to hang on to things like antidepressants and overprotectiveness and his inexplicable behaviour at the dam.
I mean, look, let's face it, it's not about justice, it's who tells the best story. That's really what it's about. And that's what's so hard to live with when your family or you have been affected by serious crime.
It's pretty depressing though, isn't it? Because, it's putting the prosecution or defence, the kind of the winning or losing of this court battle over and above seeking to understand.
And that's exactly what I'm saying. That's what's so disappointing for people that get involved in the justice system. It is. It's a loss of faith in a lot of ways, that we think the justice system is the balance, it's the scales being balanced, but it isn't.
If this episode raised any concerns for you, help is available. Call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Trial by Water is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. It's hosted and reported by me, Michael Bachelard. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. She's also the head of investigative podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, you should make sure to rate and review the podcast. It's really meaningful and it helps other people find it. And we'd love it if you recommended it to your friends as well. There's going to be lots of movement in this case next year. There'll be an appeal lodged, and we're still trying to speak to Robert Farquharson on the record, which we haven't been able to do so far. So watch out for more bonus episodes. And if you have any tips or questions about the case, anything you think I should know, I always love hearing from listeners, and I'll always try to respond. My email address is mbachelard@theage.com.au. Meanwhile, subscribe to The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald to read more. Thanks for listening.